Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to the PdBA Lisboa online talk. We're doing a very different talk today on a Sunday morning in Lisbon. So thank you for those watching. I am Lia Carreira. I'm the curator and manager of the project called Palácio de Belas Artes Lisboa, which we call PdBA for short. And this is an independent artistic and curatorial project that through our online platform, we host online talks, but also exhibitions, workshops, and residencies, also both in Lisbon and at an international level. We invite artists, curators, researchers, and a whole set of different creatives to reimagine other possible relationships between the physical space and the digital space. We focus on a particular palace, which is Palácio Iglesias, became known as the Palácio de Belas Artes. This is why we are called PdBA. But I want to talk about this project because we've talked about this specifically, this Palácio specifically in other talks, which also invite you to listen to some other time. And also invite you to check our channels for a more in-depth description of our Palacio and our previous developed programs and projects. For the last program, 2024 and 2025, we hosted a series of activities on the topic of digital spatiality. And the result of this program, we realized that we need to go a little bit more in depth in other subjects related to it. And this became the new topic of 2026, which is invisible infrastructure. So in this program, we try to discuss a little bit more about those infrastructures that underpin and challenge not only the development and the relationship with this specific palace, which is the focus of our investigations, but the entire social, cultural, and economical apparatus linked to the creation, development, conservation, and promotion of national cultural heritage. So by infrastructure, we're not only thinking about the physical apparatus around this palace and around cultural heritage, but also other forms that establish the basis of the operation, meaning not only equipments, facilities, and technologies, materiality itself, but also the communities and networks of action, support, and affection that surrounds it and sustains it. So this invisibility is called in terms of not only the ever more digital aspect and virtual nature of these elements, but also because we want to discuss other senses like olfactory, auditory, and so on, and also the relationships and networks that work with it. When we establish a relationship with these spaces and so on. So this includes the communities, like I mentioned, and the effects that make these spaces. And this is more or less, very broadly speaking, the topic of today's session. So today's session is called Urban Contiguities and Discontinuities, where we invited writer, researcher, and cultural practitioner Parsa Sanjana Sajid from Bangladesh. Um, and she's going to talk about her recent project at Largo Residências, a space where we've been also collaborating with a few times. And she done a residency there in 2024 where she investigated micro-level negotiations of neighborhoods from the perspective of immigrant communities in Lisbon. Um, this connects also to our upcoming talk with Martha Silva, who's from Largo, and was invited to talk about the importance of establishing community spaces and networks for social and cultural local development. So I also invite you to join us next week here in the same channel. So Wednesday at 7 p.m. Lisbon time. And for this specific talk today, and part of the Invisible Infrastructure 2026 program, our talk will also address modes of enacting within the negotiation of public social spaces, as well as the many entanglements of notions of home, journey, and leisure that constitute ecology of space and placemaking, which is the concept and topics that Parsa works with. So Parsa is, like I said, a writer, a researcher, and she works across disciplines spanning digital, visual, literary cultures, social spaces and movements, migration practice, and gender justice. Her writings have appeared in the Funambulist, Migrant Journal, Caravan, Ellipses, a journal for creative research, March, which the PdBA was also a part of, and this is how we started our conversation as well, among many others. Her recent initiatives include an artistic research project on mud, leisure, and architecture for PARSE Journal's biannual conference. This is a project in 2025. She also was involved with Disquietous. I'm sorry if I'm reading this wrong. A curatorial intensive and group show in Dhaka, and an imbrication of data and corporality, digital and physical spaces. Um, and the multi-venue Cinema Palestine Bangladesh that's happening since 2023 and ongoing. That said, I would then like to welcome our guest today. So, hello, Pastor. Welcome to the PdBA Online Talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, both to PdBA and to the work. Shall we start with
Yes.
introducing? Yeah.
Yes, I had already posed a few questions. I always try to pose a few questions beforehand, but I know also me and Pastor have been conversing a lot about these topics in the previous years. So I first wanted to ask you to present a little bit about your recent projects, specifically the ones you developed here in Lisbon with Largo. And I remember we first met in 2024 as well, when you were developing, I think, an independent investigation on the Bangladeshi community in Lisbon. And then you returned in 2025 for this residency. So tell us a little bit more about this experience. Talk us through your recent investigations on the topic. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me actually start the screen share, the presentation. So, wait, give me a moment. Do you see the screen or no?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Take your time.
Yeah. Okay.
In the meantime, I can ask those who are watching. You can
Mhm.
pose questions through the chat.
Yeah.
We can ask Pastor throughout the conversation, or we will have a session at the end where we can focus more on the question.
Mhm.
So please pose a question on the chat, and we will read them throughout the conversation.
Yeah, it was working very well, but
Yeah, we
now
were
I
just
don't.
testing it. It's fine. It always
Yeah.
happens.
Um.
Just a
Check.
second.
Yeah. Okay, now it's back here.
Okay, perfect.
All right, working.
Yes, you can
Yeah.
put full screen as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to put full screen. Okay. Great.
Perfect.
Thank you again. So what we are going to do right off the bat, how I was thinking of this presentation as we were discussing with Leah, is I'm going to talk about my time spent in Lisbon during this residency, and generally tie it with my interests, and then go into some conceptual considerations since the residency ended, because it was in the summer of 2025. So that was last year. So as Leah mentioned, I'm a writer, researcher, curator, and my interests include the social space, that social space and negotiations of social space, and that includes specifically urban public spaces and also digital socialities, as well as migration, digital and visual culture, gender, among others. what interested me about doing a project like this in Lisbon, and I say that I will add a few disclaimers as well, is that it felt like so urban spaces, as you know, we know, are amalgamations, and there are certain negotiations that happen that are both visible and invisible. And Lisbon, with its migrant communities, especially Bangladeshi migrant communities, lent itself to think about this topic further for me. In 2025, when I was in Lisbon, I was doing another separate project on migrant communities in Lisbon. And from that, I wouldn't say kind of this one with Largo developed from that, but it gave me a certain foundation to think about the negotiation of spaces at a very micro grassroots level. And how kind of, you know, these spatial, temporal, affective negotiations happen against certain broader narratives, namely ultranationalism, namely a very, you know, anti-immigrant, anti-migrant sentiment. So that's kind of the grounding from where I speak. Having said that, I also want to be clear about a couple of things, is that I have tried to approach this project with the thinking that this is not a typically social scientist leaning project, although there is an element of that. What I mean by that, although my methodology relied heavily on interviews and observation and secondary research, I also wanted to be conscious of a certain position of being a researcher and constantly presenting certain communities up for study, up for exploration, up for visibility, because I think that there is a problematic framing inherent to that. So as I said, my background is in being interested in how certain socialities work, including in urban public spaces, and the kind of, you know, the role of certain locations, imaginations, spatial temporal negotiations work out, especially when we are thinking about migration, and especially when we are thinking about a certain, you know, manifestation of migrant narratives and aesthetics. The methodology that I used, as I said, was interviews, observations, literature, and reference reviews. I will not go so far as to say that this is a participant-led research. Again, to use a very, you know, social scientific term. At the same time, I wanted the work to be guided by the conversations that I had. And I wanted to use the conversations with the communities in Lisbon that I spoke to, and I'll come to that, how kind of that ended up happening, to guide the work. In that sense, the idea of how certain negotiations of spaces happen, that was what I conceptualized, but the specificities of that, including the idea of leisure, the idea of rest, the idea of work, the idea of home, the idea of journey, those things are the products of the conversations that I had. So the residency that I did was based out of Largo Residências in Lisbon, and I should kind of do special shout out to them for making this possible for me. So thank you to them as well. And through that, I'd met people from this cooperative called Bandim Cooperative, and I'm also very grateful to the people who are part of that wonderful cooperative. So I met the migrant community members through mostly a snowball effect, which is through my own kind of effort and trying to have conversation with members of the community, and also through Largo and through that Pandim and through that, their network. So there was a snowball effect through which that happened. And I ended up speaking mostly to people who are from Bangladeshi backgrounds. I had an interest in speaking to members of the Bangladeshi community, although I should also add here that I do have a little bit of, the nationalist framing of thinking about migration through simply kind of national belonging itself is something that I am very critical of. But having said that, the way migration happens, formally or informally in many ways, is through just, if you think about kind of the production of legality, illegality, the administrative ease or hurdles, we cannot also ignore the formation of this, nation state. So people who are from Bangladesh here, are kind of legible or made invisible because they are of a certain national, belonging, especially, Bangladesh, the community members that I spoke to. There was another reason, because I wanted these conversations to not feel like just extractive, meaning just going and getting information from them. I wanted to have, in the small time that I had, built meaningful relationships. And that requires trust. That requires having a conversation that feels more two-way rather than just, a gathering of information and using people simply as data. And to build that trust, to have that, two-way conversation, one, requires time. Two, also requires a certain kind of familiarity, which was possible for me because I'm from Bangladesh, to have those with people from similar backgrounds. So that's another consideration why this ended up being, with people from Bangladesh.
Do you think also that language and language barrier plays a role in that selection as well?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I speak two languages well enough, English and Bengali. I do understand Hindi and Urdu and can, have a broken conversation. But if I don't speak any other languages. So language definitely played, language barrier and language accessibility definitely played a big role in connecting to the people that I ended up connecting to. So now
because I imagine that's also a topic that comes up in these conversations, right? Because the community that's here also not only suffers the pressure of, having to speak Portuguese, for example, and so on. So I think that's also an element that comes in when you're talking to them and discussing their experience in Portugal, for example. And I was also going to mention that we did have also a conversation at Lago in August about your residency, which was really interesting. And you can feel network and the connections that you established, because people also attended that, and it was a very lovely setting. So I was also going to ask if now, after that, supposedly that was also a moment where you kind of concluded your research, but it was very fresh still from your residency. There was a time, a distancing where you went back home and you reflected about it, and now we're back here again talking about this topic. So how that also plays in terms of your research and your practice, this kind of
Mhm.
having some distance from the subject or having new conversations about it, and also what did you take from that session in August at Largo?
Okay, I will answer it in a kind of two parts, because I do want to talk about that session as well as what my, kind of like what came off of that residency. As I was saying, I like to think of what I gathered was guided by the conversations I had and kind of their understanding of their space. So very quickly, before I go on to kind of how I have since kind of conceptualized that work, is that this idea of dream, home, leisure, rest were issues that kind of were highlighted repeatedly from the conversations I've had when I was interested in asking the people about how they understood their space, right, in Lisbon, both figuratively and literally. And what I mean by that is that there is this community which is in Lisbon, working very visibly coded as immigrants. There is contestations about belonging. From the migrant community's perspective, the Bangladeshi communities that I had spoken to, they were still kind of navigating this idea of belonging in Lisbon, meaning that for some of them, they had left. So their idea of home, they had left Bangladesh some years ago, and they had made, even if it was based on a conditional belonging, they had made a certain kind of home in Lisbon. At the same time, the idea of, a journey or idea of, finding a certain kind of belonging hadn't ended. So what and how they conceptualized home was something that repeatedly came up. So home for them was, conceptualized as, something back home, but also Lisbon. But this, a journey of finding a kind of belonging was also, finding a home. So that was a very repeated theme that came up, and how this this kind of negotiation of space happened is that one person, and I mentioned this during our very wonderful discussion over the summer last year, is that one person said that their idea of home was really limited because they felt that they were every day, the everyday negotiation of space was basically going from work to work. They had a place of work, but going back home was also a lot of work because of, they had to take care of the home, the cooking, the family, so there was no rest. For another person who had walked, so there was one person that I spoke to who was from Pakistan and who had walked from Lahore all the way to Lisbon, obviously not continuously. He had, taken breaks. And so I did kind of a mapping of this long journey from all the way from Pakistan to Portugal. But for this gentleman in Lisbon, his workplace was where all his social and private life kind of converged, meaning that his friends, I mean, his home in Lisbon was just a few walks away from his place of work, but his social life, private life, everything kind of revolved around his place of work. So he was just very work focused, and home in a way was the place of work, and there was no time for leisure. In terms of leisure and rest itself, there are certain spaces in Lisbon, and I will get into that when I'm, talking about kind of like how I have since kind of conceptualized the work. Is there are certain places in Lisbon that are coded as very immigrant friendly, and as seen as a place of suspicion, of criminality in certain ways. And for many of them, those were the places, for them was in fact, places of leisure and rest. So where if I tried to do, through that work, certain psychogeographic mappings of how and visualize through sketches, very minimally, I would say.
By the way,
where was
just to interrupt
yes,
you, we can't see
yeah,
your screen anymore. So if you're sharing something in terms of your sketches, can
okay,
you try and share the screen again so we can see it?
okay. Did it stop? Oh wait, why did it?
In the meantime, I'll try to see if there's any questions.
Mm-hmm.
But we are only in the beginning of our conversation anyway, so let's give it time. Yeah, now it's back.
Okay, it's back. If I go back to this screen,
if you want to go to full screen,
yeah, full screen. So this was somebody who was, telling me, and again, as I said, these are not actually literal mappings. These are, kind of a psychogeographic mappings, and there are places of where they lived, where they worked, they worked. They lived in this place called Amadora, and they worked in Lisbon. Leisure for them was the breaks that they got in between work, and leisure was also breaks that they would get when they would go to the sea with friends, for example, to Sintra. So I did a series of sketches like this to kind of show how people were thinking about this idea of, their idea of home and leisure and belonging. And for many of them, embedded in this idea of home and belonging was this idea of, a dream. One person told me that, I like every time when I take the train from home to work, I am constantly dreaming of, of a better life. Sounds very cliched, but that's what, for many of us, in fact, there is that chase for something better. And he would close his eyes on his train journey and kind of think about, that better life, and think about when this journey would be over. And the sketch that I'm showing, this person told me that, I every day I dream if I had kind of an Aladdin's lamp, and I will kind of rub it, and I will wake up in, in a life that felt more comfortable. But going back to the idea of language, this person actually specifically mentioned, because she thought that having a language literacy in Portuguese would make her life so much better. So her dream was to kind of like have this, Aladdin's lamp, and rub the lamp, and she would wake up overnight and she would be very well versed in Portuguese. So that was her dream. So the outcome, I would say, of the residency were these sketches and conversations that I tried to capture. Since I have had some more distance, I have kind of thought of or tried to kind of organize what I gathered from my time in kind of 3 separate, if overlapping, segments. Because my goal is simply not, I mean, these stories are very important and are the bedrock, but I also want a certain kind of a conceptual underpinning, because this is simply not about presenting stories as isolated. There is kind of a foundational grounding, that underpins this. So, and again, my interest at the end of the day is to understand kind of location and space, and this idea of formation of public space and their negotiation. So one way to think about is through the idea of hypervisibility and invisibility. And what I mean by that, there are 2 things happening. There is this, not balance, because it is kind of an imposed on migrant communities, is this constant erasure and surveillance. So there is erasure, which is kind of making them invisible or not giving them recognition or acknowledgement. At the same time, there is hypervisibility through constant surveillance. And there, if I may, there are certain examples. For example, one person said that the areas in Muraria or around Marti Munish, they're heavily surveilled. There are CCTV cameras around mosques. There are, these CCTV cameras that, those images and videos are kind of spread in the public realm in Portugal to kind of, build a certain narratives about the migrant communities as interlopers, right? And them being outsiders or aliens or from, different culture. So there is that hyper visible and surveillance, but that visibility happens along the lines of, marking them as suspicious, not belonging. At the same time, there is a constant erasure, because there is not a recognition of these people who are part of the social fabric as, as much as anybody else, as legitimate people who belong legitimately, or or as legitimate inhabitants. So this is how this kind of erasure and surveillance is happening. So hypervisibility and invisibility is something to think about here. The other thing is that I said, recording and reordering in vis-a-vis histories and narratives, meaning there is a sense that there is an ahistorical, reordering, I would say, because the beginning, how this is narrativized, the beginning seems to be just, around the corner, in that sense that as if, people from these faraway shores have just landed in Portugal or Lisbon, who are Black and brown and immigrants and not of the native culture, right? So there is this outsider, but it is ahistorical because there is a longer recorded history between Bengal and Portugal, for example. As we should all know, but it is not as acknowledged or recognized. So there is that reordering happening, because in Bengal, for example, one of the first Europeans that showed up were the Portuguese, and in many of our colonial recorded history, obviously, there is the history of, to more than 200 years of British rule. But before that, there were the Portuguese, right, who set up settlements in Bengal. And in many ways, if you look at literature from that time, Bengali literature, there is the lore, and also based on historical fact of the Portuguese being, pirates in the sea, in kind of, the Bay of Bengal. So there is a longer history there that simply is not acknowledged, and that is a history based on European colonization. And ignoring that, erasing that, there is, a kind of an ahistorical narrativization, and that ahistorical narrativization is kind of reordering, the time and space as if this is just happening. So there is, that as well. So hypervisibility and invisibility is also happening, in that kind of recording and reordering of both recent and, the longer history.
I want to
So
just
that's
make a comment on that, because we also did for 2024 and 2025 another project with Indonesian artist Eko Saputra, and that was also something that we discussed in terms of how certain narratives and certain historical linearity, if you want to call it, has a certain selection in collective memory. And also it was the same thing with Indonesia. We went to archives, we asked people, we tried to find documents and elements for ECHO also to work through for our online exhibition, which I invite everyone also to check it out. But we also, we encountered a lot of forgetfulness of this history, where the same way Portugal was actually the first nation to arrive there in terms of colonial history. And this, it seems to have been forgotten because it was such a short period of time comparatively. It was less than 100 years that they established some sort of commercial extractivist relationship with Indonesia. So it was very hard to actually find documents or to place them, because either they were misplaced, displaced, or mislabeled sometimes. And this has happened. So it's not only in terms of what is happening now, in terms of this relationship with the migrant communities that are in not only Lisbon but the whole of Portugal and have always been. But it is also, driving back into, early 1500s and even before that. So just a little comment that is not specific. I think it goes across so many other historical accounts and cultural relationships. Yeah.
No, thank you. And again, yes, it is not unique at all, but it is something that is, repeated across, it's repeated across multiple histories, and there are multiple histories here which are forgotten or erased and not acknowledged. So there is a kind of, a recording and reordering. Recording means that there is that, hyper surveillance of the immigrants, right? And I also had this, after the conversation, and I think we have spoken about it, that in December and late 2024, or early 2025, there was a highly publicized raid in this street in near Martimonish, Rua de Ben Morforso, if I'm pronouncing it right. And that is a street that is the heart of the Bangladeshi community in terms of their businesses, their commercial activities. Many of them live there, but many of them also find that space a space of, again, leisure, right? That's where they kind of, do business, do their shopping, congregate, have their social life, but very, very heavily surveilled. And that's where that raid happened. And there was, backlash from the immigrant rights activists, very justifiably so. But my point is, yes, you're right, that this has happened across not only, the history between Bengal and Portugal, that particular history, but across all kind of, histories that Portugal has been part of. But there seems to be, again, not only forgetting, I would say that there is not an acknowledgement, or there is an erasure, and through that, a reordering of a certain kind of narratives, because it's simply not erasure, simply not forgotten, because then the reordering starts in a way that kind of thinks of as history beginning now and not before, right? A reordering happens in a way that it only identifies, right, people now who are in Portugal as not part of authentic Portuguese history. We can obviously question what is authentic and what is real, but also forgetting that there were Portuguese, people who also, were showing up in that part of the world as well. So there is that kind of, through that erasure, through that forgetting, a reordering of a certain kind of narrative is what I'm trying to, drive home here. And that is definitely happening with the Bangladeshi community, but all other, people from the African diaspora, people with, the Indonesian diaspora as well. Second is this idea, which I would like to, in fact, develop a little further, is this idea of Kish nationalism, which I've actually a term that I'm using also in Bangladesh in a different context, but every nationalist project needs a certain kind of, mythos. And there is selling, a transaction, a production, a product involved. In this particular case, especially in Lisbon, the people from the Bangladeshi community who work in Lisbon often work in these small stores that sell these very touristy souvenirs, right? And this idea and fantasy of Portugal, right? Or Lisbon, which is, very kishy. And they're the ones who are kind of selling this idea of Portugal, the idea of that nation, that idea of this authentic history, which is scrubbed clean of not only this, the history of colonization as we talked about, but it is also scrubbed clean of the labor or the community that is selling this idea of Portugal. So there is, in these artifacts, there is a certain kind of dislocation happening. They're kind of displaced and dislocated. They are selling it, but they're also not part of it. I'm not going to suggest as a result now I am, as I said, very critical of a certain kind of nationalist formation. So the idea, the counter idea or the counter aesthetics or the counter move, now I would not want to suggest this idea of a very limited idea of, inclusion, as if, things would be better if suddenly in these, magnets and bottle openers, we saw a different kind of visualization or expression or aesthetic. That is not my point. But the point as it stands is this, there is an idea of Portugal that is being sold. And as it were, and as it happens, that idea of Portugal is being sold by these migrants who are seen as kind of the enemies, of Portugal, or made suspicious or criminalized. So there is something there about the Kish nationalism, which I, would call a product. On the other hand, there was a restaurant usually, and I mentioned this during our, summer talk as well, there is a certain kind of staking of a space, and inserting themselves within that space happening in many migrant communities around the world. In fact, when you go to these neighborhoods, you see the restaurant names, for example, would recall names of their home countries, quote unquote home countries that they left behind. So let's say Taste of Lahore or Taste of Dhaka, or But in this, I found a very interesting restaurant called Taste of Lisbon. And Taste of Lisbon was basically a South Asian restaurant with very typically South Asian menu on offer. So I thought of that, even if they did not mean to, in the kind of public sphere and the visualization of what you see, again, an insertion of the community itself, as if to say that here, this also could be a taste of Lisbon, right? And it's a very, South Asian inflected fare on offer. The third and last one, again, something that I have been developing and thinking about in another context in Bangladesh is the idea of, excuse me, miscellaneous territory. So any city, it's not only Lisbon, it's not only, spaces which are migrant community heavy. Any space is an amalgamation, and any space is a combination of certain temporal and spatial negotiations. There is, myth making, there is reality, there's all kinds of things happening. And the best way to think about that in contra or in opposition to the idea of, authenticity or an inert history or a linear history is the idea of, hybrid space and a miscellaneous territory, which is an amalgamation or made up of, miscellanies rather than one thing. And how that happens in Lisbon is that I would say is one example is the creation of a parallel topography and vocabulary. So, for example, there are, and what I also enjoy about Lisbon, there are all these parks dotted around the city. And if two examples, one is that in addition to the examples that I gave, many of these immigrants also work in the delivery and service sector. And often you would find them resting in these parks or street corners. So there is a way, and they're listening to, if you kind of like understand, they're listening to Bengali music or they're watching a YouTube video. So there is an auditory overlap happening right on top of that space. These parks, these are technically open to everybody, and they do kind of, they definitely, belong there. At the same time, as I said, that in many ways, the way hypervisibility works, that many of these immigrants are constantly kind of surveilled and are made to feel that they don't belong or are seen suspiciously. But the fact that they are, all over the city, going about their day, and that everyday life, there is a layering that is happening, the way they're kind of, spending their everyday in that space. So there is that, through what they're listening to, through where they're resting, there is a parallel topography that is being created. And the vocabulary, many people that I spoke to said that for many of the parks, the Bangladeshi community have their own names. It's because it's easier for them to have a name that they can pronounce instead of the Portuguese names, and it's something that is easy for them to mark. So, for example, they would call a particular park Hashmurgi Park, meaning like where there are kind of a lot of ducks. So they would call it a duck park. Or if a park where the elderly would go take a walk, they would call that park in Bengali where kind of the elderly go to work. So there is kind of a naming practice that was happening around these parks. Again, I'm not saying that this is something unique, but this is illustrative of the fact that once people start navigating a space, in addition, kind of to the official, to the more visible, there are ways that they also kind of, they negotiate the space in their own way, right? And naming practices, belonging in those spaces in a certain way, right, creates a certain parallel vocabulary as well. Now, am I also like the last section I was saying, I'm not saying that that should become, legible or visible, or the park names should change, overnight. But this is, one way that a certain hybrid territory, a parallel space is created in any kind of public and social space, because public and social spaces are not inert, right? They are made, any built environment is made through different social relations. And those social relations, must and should include the people who are there, including the immigrants, right? And there is a concerted effort to make them, excluded. And my proposition is to, the way we have kind of, the way I have thought about it is to show, right, how not to make it, in an inert way inclusive, not to make it an inert way, more legible, and not to say that there needs to be a certain kind of validation from the powers that are not giving them validation. But at the same time, right, there is a staking of a space happening bottom up, right? That is a space making, name making, place making that is happening, over time. And that is how a space is regenerated, right? And a space can become regenerative.
And not to take the merit out of this, but also
Mhm.
just to make it more perhaps understandable across everyone, is that like you said, this is how places are placed and made. So
Uh-huh.
it's not just that, the Brazilians or any other of the African immigrants that we have here as well, and from Asia as well. But even I imagine the Portuguese, right? So it's
Uh-huh.
in me in Brazil would also, call a different space from another non-official name, because that's part of it. And it could be also in your own bubble, and it could be gender related. It could be also divided by age related. So maybe a younger generation will call a space something specific because that's what they share in terms of identification of those spaces. So I think it's something that I think people need to recognize as something that is inherent to our social beings in terms of
Mhm.
how we relate to space and how we transform those spaces. Of course, there are instances that becomes political, and that becomes a little bit more obvious as well. In Brazil, we take a stance in terms of streets that have been named after dictators. So we want to call it something else, and that becomes explicitly and directly intentional as a political stance of renaming that space, because we want to also make a stance out of it, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and again, I'm not I through this investigation or exploration or the discussions that I have, the issue was not to um, show that what was happening, in terms of how the Bangladeshi immigrants were negotiating the space as unique, but in fact that's how space is made. So my point is to propose that this is inherently a part of space making and place making.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that is how we should understand, right, community and belonging. And that is how we should kind of understand a longer history or narrativization, um, that it is in fact inherently uh, always changing and becoming, right? There are multiple histories. There is a belonging that is more complicated than authentic. There is this idea of, different kinds of topography and vocabulary working, and there is the beauty in that. in that, right? Rather than trying to enact this very exclusive space and through that very exclusive history.
And I like your research because you ask us to pay more attention to the micro level. And I think that's really important in terms of the moment that we're living now. I think people are looking too much at the macro level and very, internal individual view of those spaces, and also very conflicting. This is mine, this is yours, you belong there, I belong here, and not seeing how you bring out, people. These are spaces where people that it's their leisure and also their workspaces, and as many of us. So this is calling us to look a little bit more in terms of also the human relationships, these, like the topic we're discussing now, these networks of affections and sharing of, of not only knowledge but experiences that happen at the micro level in living spaces. These are spaces that we live through, right? So I think that's a very important part of your research, is really calling attention. Like, we need to also pay attention to, these nuances within the formation of these spaces.
And lastly, because this is related to kind of the broader rubric that PdBA Lisboa is organizing under, is this idea of infrastructures. I can share, links later. I did a short sound recording on the idea of, for a different project, on the idea of how I think about, infrastructures and building networks. And because that was also connected to how I think about, spaces, because that is an interest of mine. And spaces where people can congregate, for example. And I was using examples from Bangladesh, but it would, in many ways apply to certain heavily surveilled immigrant communities in Lisbon too, where people simply can congregate in a public space, right, are becoming increasingly limited and surveilled and, curtailed. And it is not by design. And it is a certain kind of infrastructure to have these public spaces available for a certain kind of congregation, right? For meeting, for a diverse set of arrangements, rather than making them, exclusive and restricting their access. Let's say the Martin Monish Park, right? That is that has gone through several, I would say, failed attempts at regeneration, because they simply did not take into account how the people who live there are, think about that, or use that. At the same time, there is this idea of the surrounding area as where, because the immigrants live there, as a place of danger, right? A place of that needs to be constantly be under the scanner, or a place that where criminality or suspicion happens. But for people who use that space, that is a space where they, in fact, can have a good time, right? A couple of people that I spoke to from my interviews during the residency told me, like, this is the place that they would, play sports. This is the place that they would, meet their friends. This is the place that they would kind of, just have a relaxed time. So for them, right, it is a very different sort of conceptualization, and conceptualization not in kind of like distance way. It's a very materially close, situation where it's an important part of how they socialize, think about, spending time, leisure time, meet with, friends, or even have a work meeting. So it's not a place of suspicions, definitely for them, but the same place, because it's so heavily migrant, is conceptualized and also in the public imagination manufactured as a space of, danger. Same space, right? Same space, but from two different balances. And I think, we spoke about this a few months ago, which actually the news made it to Bangladesh, right? There was, I think, in Portugal, these political ads that went up that says, this is not Bangladesh, right? I would venture a couple of things here. People who, put up, I wouldn't imagine that they know much about Bangladesh, but they do have an idea of Bangladesh, right? Which is based on a certain racialized, notion of, there is that place that is let's say impoverished, or a place where those brown people live, or that is heavily Muslim. So again, these are all markers, and markers that are immediately that transmit that idea of danger. And by saying this is not Bangladesh, you are transmitting a certain idea of Portugal as well, which is again driven to make the idea of belonging and space making very limited for the people who are living there, particularly the Bangladeshi community in Lisbon. So to say that this is not Bangladesh, meaning like you're basically putting that scanner on them, like this cannot become Bangladesh, which is that place out there, and these people don't belong there. So I think there is definitely an opportunity to think about, the idea of place and space and history in a much more composite manner, in a much more overlapping manner, rather than this, place that is isolated and only, belonging to a particular group.
Very excluded in that sense as well. So,
yeah.
Thank you so much, Vas. I think we are reaching our time. I don't know if you want to share a few more things. In the meantime, please place your questions if you have in the chat, and we will read them. But do you have anything else to share in terms of your presentation? No, because it's gone again. So I'm not sure.
There is two last
I was
slides.
also going to
Sorry.
ask in the meantime, like I always ask, like, how can people reach you for those who want to place any questions afterwards? And also this recording would be available for everyone throughout the lifespan of our project. You can definitely see this and much more in our channel in terms of the talks that have passed. We'll also try to share more information about Parsa's research throughout our channel, specifically on Instagram as well. Yeah, so is there a way people can reach out to you, and also tell us about your upcoming projects, and where you're taking this to? And
thank you. Upcoming projects can go in many different directions. I'll just keep to this particular project. I am working on a publication coming out of this, so which will include the sketches that I did, some photographs, and some fragments of text. So there will be a booklet that is in design and production phase now, so which should be available in a couple of months. And beyond that, and these are kind of, I am thinking of evolving this research and thinking about maybe the possibility of collaborative exhibition, depending on resources that may or may not be available. So I do want to evolve this further. As I said, I want to think about the idea of selling Portugal and Kish nationalism a little bit further, and perhaps do an exhibition around that. So there is that in I wouldn't say in the pipeline because, as I said, like this is subject to the availability of resources, but that is the plan. But the publication is something that is already in the pipeline, is being planned. And there is one other thing. I asked my conversation partners to contribute a piece of music. So there is a 6 title track, which is included, that their titles are included in the booklet. There will be in the publication. But I am also developing at a very preliminary stage, developing a sound piece out of that. Hopefully, we can also put that out in public. So that's what's ahead in terms of this particular project. And how to contact me. As Leah said, if there are any questions and comments, I can take that. But I have a website, which is my full name, parsasanjanasajid.com. So people can visit that and learn more about my work. And there is contact information there that anyone can use to email me, which is info@parsasanjanasajid.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor. Thanks so much for this presentation. As a reminder, we'll be happy also to share the results of this research, the publication, and so on our channels as well. Once you get them published, and the website and email that Pastor just mentioned is in the description of our online talk, so it's easier also if anyone wants to reach out. Yeah, so I think that's it. Thank you so much, Pastor. This is always a pleasure to talk to you and talk about this. We've been on and off in terms of conversation, and I do hope we get back to this. I always love to re-invite people to, in a few years, to just look back also and see how things progressed and changed and moved on. So yeah, the invitation extends indefinitely for us to continue this conversation also with Largo. So I also invite people again, a reminder of our talk next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Lisbon time with Marta Silva, who's going to present a little bit more about Largo Residências, the institution that Pastor just did a residency there last year and just talked about the project. So it's nice to also contextualize this, where this was the placemaking exactly specifically, and we're going to talk more directly in terms of the importance of these networks in the community, specifically also in terms of social economy, creative economies that are developed within these spaces. Yeah, and I also want to thank our founder and supporter, Disquietous, who's the National Directory of the Arts in Portugal, who makes these events free and possible to everyone. So thank you very much. And yeah, thank you, Pastor. You want to say
Thank you.
last words, last goodbyes?
No, thank you. Thank you to PdBA. Thank you to Largo. And I should also add a thank you to my interlocutors at Bandim. And I hope that I get to work with all of you again.
Yeah, hope so too. You come back.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for listening and watching us. See you next time.
Okay.